Welcome to Brave Inflections. My name is Claudelle von Eck, and I have today with me one of my absolute favorite people. I love chatting to him. We can talk for hours on end, and that is Benjamin Pogrund. Been a journalist for many, many, many years. Was also at some point the deputy editor of the Rand Daily Mail, but why an author of a number of books. But why I wanted to talk to him in this interview is to tap into his vast experience. He was in South Africa during the apartheid years, friend to some really important people like Sobukwe and Nelson Mandela, and he's had conversations with them. But I want to get into his brain and get a little bit of insight from his perspective. I will put the rest of his CV on the website so you can see everything that he's done in his very illustrious career. But let me start, B, thank you, and I call him B, he's my friend. B, start off by asking this question: why journalism?
Hello, Claudelle. I wanted to change the world, as simple as that. And that's not a good thing. For a journalist who wants to change the world, that means you're a missionary. And that means you're an advocate journalism, hewing to a particular line. And everything you write has got to fit into your missionary aim. I was lucky, though, because already by that stage, I had 3 university degrees from UCT, including social science. And by the time I started journalism, I was firmly grounded in a belief in facts. And that saved me because I could only write straight. I wasn't able to hew a line. And really the lodestar of my life I discovered in doing a degree in social science in a quote from Charles Booth, who was the mid-19th century British pioneer of social surveys. And something he said has served me all my life. And what he said basically, it is by facts that the world must be changed, but it is by emotion if the world is to be moved and changed aright, in the right way. And that to me has been my lodestar. When I report straight. It used to be my pride as a young reporter, if I reported Prime Minister Verwoerd, which I did, or I reported Chief Luthuli, which I did it in the same dispassionate way. I never use the word objectivity, dispassionate. And that's been the creed of my life. And so I entered journalism, wanting to change the world, but making a distinction when I was reporting or when I was commentating. When I was commentating under my name, then I could express my views. But when I was reporting, straight on. And I was committed to that.
And I hope reporters today are listening to what you're saying, because I think that is one of the things that we're starting to see waning in journalism as a profession. That real passion that you bring to understanding what it is that your role is as a journalist. Now, one of the things that you did was to pioneer reporting on the Black existence, the reality that Black people were experiencing in South Africa. You pioneered bringing it into mainstream media. So can you talk to me a little bit about when did the penny drop that is something that you should do?
It began with me as a student. When I did that social science degree, I spent one university holiday doing field work, and I was attached for several weeks to a social welfare officer from the government, the Department of Social Welfare, whatever it was called. And the big townships didn't exist then. Langa was there on a much smaller scale, but we were dealing with the urban poor. District 6 existed then, and Woodstock. And I was going with him day after day into these dreadful slums. And I used to watch and think, well, he's doing good work, he's helping people, but he's only covering up the sore. the sore remains underneath,
Yeah.
and you've got to get to grips with that. And that's where the idea as a young man, a young student, I was 16 when I went to university, began to evolve, that you had to change the world in order to get rid of these terrible problems. And that's how it came to me. When I moved from Cape Town to Johannesburg, and I was first with an industrial company for a year as an executive trainee, the Cape Times at that time had been quite a good newspaper, I thought. When I got to Johannesburg, the morning paper, the Rand Daily Mail, was a dreadful rag, really a bad paper. But when I was there, a new editor was appointed by the name of Lawrence Gander. And word started spreading about this because the Rand Daily Mail started running analyses of apartheid under the name of Owen Vine, which were his two middle names. And there was an excitement every week when Owen Vine's articles appeared, because until then, the English-speaking, the English press were against apartheid. In fact, I thought they were mainly anti-Afrikaner. They basically agreed with apartheid, and I could recognize that. Suddenly, you had these analyses of apartheid in the most wonderful flowing English, and they were electrifying. And everyone started sitting up and paying attention. I was able to get onto the Rand Daily Mail, and what made everything possible was that I had an editor who believed in what I wanted to do. Because I was also, before the Mail, there was a fortnightly magazine newspaper called Contact, started by Patrick Duncan in the Liberal Party. I was a member of the Liberal Party, and I was therefore going to political meetings. I was meeting Mandela and Sobukwe and so on, and writing articles for Contact. And I was getting all the stuff into Contact, and Contact was running articles about what was going on the black scene. But here was I on mainstream newspapers, nothing appeared, nothing.
Sure.
Blacks barely existed. Blacks existed in crime cases, a rock fall in a mine. Last night, a white miner, Mr. van der Westhuizen, and 6 natives died in a rockfall.
Yeah.
An accident. A native was killed on the corner of Jeppe Street yesterday. No names, nothing. Occasionally, a paragraph about what a black leader said. They didn't exist, and they were the majority of people. And this got through to me. This is crazy. This is what a newspaper should be. A general paper. So I started going to meetings on my own time, at night and over weekends, and it was a turbulent period in the ANC, and there were stories there. And I was just about always the only white journalist there. Sometimes there were black journalists, and these conferences used to be terrible. They were supposed to start at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and I was there at 8 o'clock. And if I was lucky, it would start at 10, 11 o'clock.
Sure.
Sunday
Running on
morning,
African time.
and I'd be there till 1 in the morning. 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, I was usually the only journalist around. I developed ulcers, I never ate, I was smoking heavily, but there was a story at the end.
Yeah.
And the Mail started carrying these stories. And gradually, people began to realize there's something going on.
But you were still fairly young, B. So that realization that you need to move people, you need to report on this, and transitioning to that, becoming the pioneer in the mainstream media to get the attention to the on the black existence. What was the most difficult aspect for you? And imagine, I can only imagine, because I wasn't born then yet, I can only imagine being in apartheid South Africa as a white journalist and now starting to move in this direction. That couldn't have been easy. What was the most difficult aspect for you?
Well, newspapers are very different then. The Rand Daily Mail was typical. Everyone was white. The reporters, the news leaders, the sub-editors, everyone was white. The whole advertising department was white and aimed only at whites. They didn't want blacks, wanted whites. The circulation department aimed at whites. Everything was white run and so on. And that was the biggest obstacle, because Laurie Gander wanted to change the paper, but it's like the story of a oil tanker going full speed. To change it takes a long time, a few miles. And you can't change the culture of a paper overnight when everyone's steeped in it. We had quite a few people who were immigrants from England, English sub-editors and so on, but also local people. And here was I coming up with all these stories about black people. No one wanted them. And the way I really got it done, I worked like a dog. I would go to the townships. I had a permit, so I was allowed to go in, because whites weren't allowed otherwise. And I'd spend the day wandering around Soweto or Alexandra or Western Native Township or places like that. And then I'd go back and I'd sit writing 8, 10, 12 stories in a day. Might be 2 inches long, 15 inches long. Well, there was no ways the paper could have carried them. It would have totally unbalanced the paper. So if I had a good day, I'd get 2 stories in. If I had a really good day, I'd get 3 stories in. But gradually the weight, gradually I got acceptance. I wasn't liked. The old phrase, if I may use it, kaffa booty, you know. But what I was showing, because after the politics, I moved into education, sewerage, housing, and writing stories about kids at school sitting on rocks in Soweto, because there were no desks and no books. It had a certain impact. I did the first expose years ago of starvation in South Africa. It had never been reported before.
Sure.
And the images which I produced in words and pictures were so shocking. They had to be carried. And Gander wanted them done. So gradually it changed, and then I started employing blacks as tipsters, getting money for tips of stories. Then we started using their stories. And then the first 2 black guys, Lawrence Marquisa, he was hired. I forget the name of the other guy for a moment. We'll come back. He was an interesting fellow. He was colored. He had enlisted in the war and been in the Transvaal Highlanders, had fought his way through the war and come back to being a colored man living in a segregated area.
Sure.
But that's how it happened.
Sure.
It was a gradual process. And because we were getting stories, other newspapers had to follow.
So I see in my mind's eye you in this very white environment and starting to push a complete in a different direction than the majority had ever even thought about going. And you've used the term that the phrase that people use in referring to you. But that must have taken an enormous amount of courage, right? So, because as human beings, typically we prefer to be liked, to be in an environment where we are liked, to be accepted. So knowing that you are not liked, being called names, having to work all these long hours and so forth, but going against the grain takes a certain amount of courage. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about courage, your views, and how do you find courage within yourself?
I'll sum it up. The late Alan Paton, you know, the wonderful author who was a friend, he was praised once for his courage. And Alan snarled, "It's not courage, it's sheer cussedness." And that's the only way to describe it. You know, to hell with you, I'm going to do this. And in fact, it got bigger, because I covered the rural areas. I was barred from them, but I still went in. And then I started going the surrounding areas. African nationalism was developing in Swaziland, came to a halt there, of course. with the monarchy in Basutoland, now Lesotho, and in Bechuanaland, Botswana, and I was covering those also. So I was leading a most incredible life, just working flat out all the time. It actually, had a bad effect on my marriage. My marriage ended, in fact. I was just working non-stop because I believed in it, and I was getting results.
So do you think that what you're now referring to is not so much courage, but it's that stubbornness? Has it got to do with the fact that you were able to clearly see the injustice, and that you just couldn't live with the fact that it exists, and you didn't want to be complicit in the process?
Claudelle, I've often thought, what brought me to this? My father had a lot of books, and his books were accessible to me, and I read from an early age. If I went to town and bought a book as a teenager, I could buy any book I wanted. My father gave it to me, plus my pocket money. Most important, I watched my father cry twice in my life, and the one time was when I was a little boy during the war, when he got news that the last of our known relatives in Lithuania had been murdered in the Holocaust. And that had a profound effect on me for the rest, right up to today. What discrimination Jews suffered over the centuries and what happened in the Holocaust became imprinted on my psyche. I've read innumerable things, I've spoken to people, and that determined my attitude in South Africa, because I saw what was done to Jews being done to people of another color in South Africa, affected me profoundly. I had a natural empathy with African nationalism, black power, black consciousness. And a friend of mine who did a thesis, Reva Krut, years later, she said to me, "Do you know why you've got that empathy?" I said, "No, I've got no idea." She said, "Go and read Pinsker." Pinsker was a doctor, a Jewish writer in 1882, who conceived the phrase of self-emancipation. And he said to Jews in Tsarist Russia, where there were the most terrible murders, millions, if you want respect from the world, stand up and respect yourself and look the world in the eye. And that is self-emancipation, it's national liberation, it's black consciousness, it's black power. It's what black people have needed and still need to have self-respect, self-belief. That's how you gain freedom.
And I'm hearing you using two different concepts, and that are two sides to the same coin in what we need and solving problems like racism and oppression. The one hand is empathy, your ability to empathize, but you first need to see the other as a fellow human being who experience pain, as what pain feels like. And on the other hand, the other side of the coin is you've got to free yourself. You've got to free your own mind. Those are so important. And I hope that the people who are listening to this conversation really think deeply about those concepts, because we all need to think about them, because in some way or the other we need to use those in our own lives as well. If you look back over that period, is there anything that you would now in hindsight would have done differently?
Wow. I'm sorry about the things I didn't do. One prime thing that the Bantustans, for example, were never explored properly. There weren't the resources, and I tried, and it was too big. I couldn't tackle it. I'm sorry about the things I didn't report. I made some mistakes on the way also, inevitably. Not too many, I hope and I think. Um, I think a large part also, just to pick up what we were talking about a moment ago, was a question of trust. That's intrinsic to existence. And you can only trust when you know. And I brought that lesson when I came to Israel and did dialogue work here. Make contact, create trust. That's fundamental. You've got to be willing to reach across and talk to people and get to know people and understand people and forgive people for what the bad things they do also, and understand why, and reach out to them. And you can't always do it. Sometimes it's so offensive, you want to have nothing to do with it. But you've got to try and understand, and that creates trust. And that was the basis of my existence as a journalist, that I trusted people to give me accurate information. Because if the information was inaccurate, I could have got into a lot of trouble, and my newspaper would have got into a lot of trouble. I had to trust them, and they had to trust me, because I was told things that could imperil people's lives, suiting their liberty. And there was that mutual trust, which is vital.
Yeah. And it's your ability to step outside of yourself and look through the lens of other people. So when you're talking about try to understand where the next person is coming from, but then also very importantly, you touch on this, the aspect of stories that you are being told. You've got to trust those, you had to trust those people that they're telling you the truth. But they also had to trust you where they were a source, an anonymous source, that you would not go and expose them. And I know that you'd been sent to jail because you refused and to reveal a source, but you've also been prosecuted, and so you've really had a hard time. I don't think a lot of people know exactly how much you had to sacrifice. I mean, you touched on your marriage, that was a sacrifice in the process as well. But personally,
But I've gained Anne in the process.
you did. But at the time, it was very difficult. I mean, and going as far as being willing to go to jail to protect your sources, being prosecuted by the government at the time. And so if you look back at that period, what are the most important lessons that you've learned?
Well, you know, that one where I protected a source of information because he'd asked me not to reveal his name. I learned a good lesson there, because I was taken before a magistrate to be questioned, and I prepared. I had the day. I prepared a statement about journalistic ethics. I was refusing to divulge. It's part of the code of journalism. It's not in law and so on. And I made this great declaration in the court. And there was this magistrate, white Afrikaner, sitting taking notes all the time, and he couldn't have cared less. He just swept us all aside and sent me to prison, you know. And I stood there thinking, you lousy lackey, you miserable so-and-so and so-and-so. Okay. So I went to prison. It wasn't too bad. You know, I came out. I went back in on appeal. My daughter, Jenny, was born as I was going in and out of prison. And there were stories in the paper about it, with a photograph of her at her birth. And about a year later, there was a general election. And I was living in Killarney, and the polling booth was a big tent which had been erected down the road. So I picked up Jenny and walked down to vote. And I walk into this tent, and who's the presiding officer? This magistrate, this horrible magistrate. He sees me, he comes running across the tent, calling out as he comes to his wife, Mummy, Mummy, come, here's the man I sent to prison. He's got his little girl with him. Come and meet them.
No
And
way.
couldn't have been nicer. And I looked at him with astonishment. He was a nice guy. He'd been doing
Goodness.
his job. And I never forgot that one. With prisons, it was a bigger lesson. 4 years went into that, and we published the truth, but we were slaughtered for it. And we've all grown up with the belief, truth will triumph. Tell the truth, and that's okay. I discovered the reverse is the case. When Laurie Gand and I, all our informants were charged, and then for 8 months, Laurie and I were on trial. And we had about 120 state witnesses against us, about 100 of whom were organized perjurers, but organized.
Sure.
And what I discovered, and we had Sidney Kentridge, the great lawyer, our lead counsel, brilliant cross-examiner. And what I discovered was, if someone is schooled in a basic story and sticks to it and doesn't deviate, you cannot break him. And that gives a compliant judge to say he was a truthful witness. We managed to break a handful of witnesses by getting absolute dirt on them, because they were all very low-grade people, and destroying them. But most of the testimony we could not undercut. Whereas an honest man, on the other hand, always has an element of doubt. And if you cross-examine an honest man, he'll admit to some doubt about what he said. So the judge can then say, he's an unreliable witness. And he's right. And that's the basic, terrible lesson I learned. Truth does not necessarily win. You've got to work very hard. And then when I was charged later on again, the security police went into the witness box and lied under oath. And I was very cross. And I did one of these silly things. The tea break came, and I walked out, and there was a group of them standing there. And I walked up to them, quivering with rage, and pointed a finger at them and said, "You lied under oath to get me convicted." And I remember one of them drew himself up and said, "We'll stop at nothing to get you." So it was that little lesson. But that was a basic lesson. You've got to guard truth. You've got to fight for it.
And that's often what I find with professionals dealing with fraud and corruption, and then find themselves victimized, that we tell people that they must stand for what is right, but we often don't tell people that it comes with a price tag. And that those who are on the wrong side of the fence are going to fight back. So the fact that you're right doesn't mean that you're always going to win. So you've got to be a lot more strategic about how you do things sometimes as well. And one sees that in so many different aspects in life. But if you go in naive, I think that is when life tends to knock us, because we expect.
It's the whistleblowers I read about in South Africa who have those are really courageous people. Because, just again, related to myself, so I'm picking up on something else I thought, was the social exclusion. I lived inside the white community, and the exclusion was a hard thing among your colleagues. The prisons, everyone was very triumphant when we published the prison exposés. Then the government went for us, and through some very dirty lies by the late Percy User, the prosecutor, we were suddenly in an absolute mess. And overnight, feelings changed, public feelings, my colleagues' feelings. And I was very, very isolated. And an enormous hostility towards me, which was very hard to live with. That went on for years.
Sure. And that is tough, because as human beings, we don't do well in living on an island. We are social beings. And
right.
Especially when it comes to people that you thought were close to you, or thought of the same views, carry the same views that you do, and then suddenly you're being ostracized because people are just scared.
There's also the fear factor.
Yes.
I'm being attacked. I had guards at various times. But all this, I was lucky. I was white, and I was on a big newspaper. I had protection up to a point. For black people, black journalists, didn't have this. That's very important to remember.
Yeah.
And it got even more because I also became the Southern African representative correspondent of the Sunday Times of London, one of the, at that stage, I think, the greatest newspaper in the world, and later the Boston Globe. So I had an international profile. I was
Mm.
very well known internationally. And I saw the effects of this because after apartheid, uh, I discovered you could get your security file. There's ones, all the files were destroyed, but the ones in the Ministry of Justice are in the National Archives, and you can apply to see your own file. No one else can see it, you can.
Uh-huh.
And I heard about the late Dalai Lama, who was a friend, told me about this. And I went and read my files. And I read several times I was up for banning orders.
Really?
And on one particular file, the minister wrote, no, it'll create too much trouble at this stage. And that
Mm.
I was too well known internationally. So they backed off.
Sure. Sure. And I think, you know, that correlates with, I find these days that a lot of white people find it very difficult to come to terms with white privilege and not really understanding that.
Yeah,
You know, what the system, how the system protects people, and if you're not aware of that, you may fall into the trap of thinking that there is nothing that you need to do on your side,
correct.
you know, to
I see
reach
that when I come
across.
to South Africa, very much so.
Mm.
I'm very conscious of it.
You've had to display, and we've touched on some of those in our conversation now. You've had to display a tremendous amount of courage. I can't even begin to imagine what it would feel like to stand in court and hear the judge send you to jail, and then still after that coming out of jail and not say, well, this has happened to me, I'm now going to look after myself, but to still carry on. So many people at some point find themselves at an inflection point where they have to display courage. What would your advice be for those people who need to display courage?
No, I'd never advise anyone. It's not for one human being to tell another. And I've been in those circumstances where one person who was a good friend of mine um, came to see me because the security police had called him in and told him he had been an informer. And he said, what must I do? They had offered him pay, which was beyond his dreams. The alternative was to be endorsed out of Johannesburg, which meant being sent into rural poverty on his own. And he said, what must I do? And I'm ashamed today even to think back to that, because I put my head down. He was sitting across my desk, and I put my head down and I said to him, that's not a question one human being can answer for another. And I still believe that. What I should have said to him, and this is to my total regret, I should have said to him, I'm your friend. Whatever you do, I will support you. Because I had no doubt when he walked out of my office, he would become an informer.
Mm.
It was an impossible choice for him. You know what his act of friendship to me was? I never saw him again. He
Mm.
never came near me. So he was never in a position to tell the police anything about me.
Sure.
But I remember that I let him down. I should have said, you're my friend, I'll be with you.
Mm. You're touching on something that is so important, that I often see what happens to whistleblowers as well, is that there is this expectation from society that you must always do the right thing, but we don't calculate the cost that comes with it. And often we find ourselves in a position where we look at somebody else and say, "You've got to display courage," but we don't ask ourselves whether we would be willing to pay
Correct.
that price.
Yeah.
And sometimes that paying that price is ultimately not in the interest of the greater good. Because if you then become diminished, how are you going to be able to live out your purpose? So it's a very difficult situation. It's
This
one of
is
those
such an individual
conversations.
thing. I would never give anyone advice about this. Look, I know in my own case, there was a lot of fear. And when I was on my own, there were times I'd sit in my bachelor apartment and sit and think and calculate and be terribly scared. And if I may talk in very personal terms, I had two guides in my life. One was my daughter, who was in about 6 or 7. And I used to think to myself, and this might be a guide for others, when she grows up, I don't want her ever to be able to look back and feel ashamed of what her father did. And the other one was Robert Sobukwe, who we'd become very good friends when he went to prison in 1960. We became very close friends over the years. And he was in solitary on Robben Island for 6 years. And we were in contact, we were writing to each other, despite delays by the authorities. And I would always think, what will Bob think about me if I do this or I do that? Became a central feature of my decision making. To this day, in fact, in his memory, because Bob was almost like my elder brother, approving, rapping me on the knuckles occasionally, and he was such a strong moral force. What he would have believed was very important to me. He and Jenny were the two factors.
Sure. And what I'm hearing you saying, and I think that is so profound, is on the one hand, there is, what legacy am I leaving behind? What would my kids think of me? And on the other hand, there is this sense of accountability. So there is this figure who I respect and trust. And even though you may not always be accountable to him in person or directly, but in your head, that accountability is there. And I think that is so beautiful and a very nice, a beautiful thought for us to close this conversation off with. So if you're talking about courage and finding courage within yourself, thinking about your legacy, but also accountability at the same time. Oh, B, I thank you so much for having this conversation with me and being so generous in sharing your thoughts and your personal stories, and that we can learn from you. I have already gotten him to agree to a second conversation. So go and have a look for that, or keep a lookout for that video. It will be on the website soon. B, once again, thank you very much. And I do hope that our viewers had been able to get really good nuggets out of our conversation. Please go and look at the rest of the website. There are a lot of different conversations that I've had, but also papers that have been written. I'm pretty sure that if you're at an inflection point in your life, that you'll find something on the website that will help you. Thank you.